Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So today we're going to be continuing on our Excel Draw app, and we're going to be implementing the undo/redo functionality. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing, and let's get right into it. So we're going to start off with looking at a bit of the theory of how undo/redo functionality generally works. There's two main patterns that we can have a look at. If you want to skip directly to the coding, I'll leave timestamps in the description. But yeah, we'll start off with the theory here. So to explain these patterns, let's just have a quick look at the how the app works just now, and then we can go on to the two. So if you imagine this is our current canvas and we have two elements, what the state looks like is this object up here, which is an array with two elements, two objects representing the elements. So how we got there is, if you imagine we have started off with an empty array, and let's just go through a sequence of actions that the user may do. So let's just say we drew a rectangle, which creates the first element. If we move or resize that, what we do is we update that element in place, or we update that object in place. And then when we draw the line, we add a new element. And of course, if we move or resize that, it just updates that one in place. Cool. So that's what we have just now. So let's have a quick look at the first pattern. Now, the first one is all based around actions or commands. It's sort of an imperative way of doing this. So you can see that the state here, which is an array, is capturing, instead of the elements represented as objects, it's actually capturing actions of how we got from the previous state to this state here, right? So if you're kind of familiar with streaming or event streaming, this is kind of a similar pattern. So if we kind of start from the beginning, if we started with an empty array, when we draw the rectangle, instead of storing the rectangle as an object, what we've done is we have an object that represents the action that we did. So we drew a square, and it would have, of course, all the additional data that we need to make up that square. And then we have the second action here that we can see for moving the square, and then one for the line, drawing the line, and one for moving the line. So we can get up to this state just by going through all the actions and applying them to our canvas. And the good thing about this is the payload is minimal. Each of these objects only have the information that they need, nothing extra. So it's easy to kind of replay movements. The difficulty is when we want to undo, then we need to add additional logic to know how to undo the action, each action. So where we have an action to move a line from A to B, we also need to understand, hey, how do you undo that feature? Does it affect everything else? So the implementation is slightly more complex. So yeah, let's move on to the way we're actually going to do it, which is this one here. And the difference here is, instead of storing the actions or commands, we're actually just storing the entire state. We're taking a snapshot of the entire state every time we do something, an action, which you can see in this history. And along that, we store this index, which is saying which state are we in. So if we remove this, and let's just walk through an example again, this arrow will hopefully help us. So if we start off with an empty array, we've got nothing on the canvas yet. When we draw the element, we go to index 1, so this goes up to 1, and now we just have an array with one element in it. This object just represents the element like it does in the current app. When we move this, what we need to do is, instead of updating it in place, we actually need to make a copy, make a snapshot, and then update the values, right? So they are two separate states. They've got different values. And then we draw the line. Again, we're moving up one index in the history, and now we've got two elements, and then we can, if we move this, we've got the final one there. And the really cool thing about this is, in order to undo or redo, all we need to do is update this state variable. So right now it's index 4. So if we want to undo, we just say, hey, actually, the state of the app is actually just index 3, move back 1, or move back 2, or actually go back forward. There's no additional logic there. So the clear disadvantage of this is the payloads are holding the entire state of the world every time, so that could get quite big for large applications. But the implementation is super simple. So this is the approach that we're going to go for. Let's dive into the coding. So we've got the code here, and we have the app on the right-hand side with the components dev tools, just to make it easier for us to look at the state. Just before we get started, there is a slight bug with the app as it is, where if you just hit the selection tool and you try to basically drag around, it's going to throw a undefined exception. And this is just because or cannot read property ID of null. In the previous version, I forgot to add a check for the selected element ID. So we tried to get the ID from selected element, but we may have not selected an element before. So to get rid of that, we're just going to add if selected element here, and we're just going to wrap this kind of logic there with that check, which means if there's no selected element, it just doesn't try to resize or recalculate anything. So that just avoids that that error. Cool. So to implement this feature, I'm going to use a custom hook. So I don't want my app component to understand the logic of the history and undoing and redoing. I want the concern to be completely separate. So we're going to do that in a hook. And what we're going to do is we're going to replace this element/set elements with this custom hook. But we're going to try to keep the kind of API the same, so it's so we don't change too much in the component. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a hook called use history. And we'll just give it the exact same signature as the use state. So this is going to take in an initial state. And to start off with, just for those of you that aren't too familiar with creating your own hooks, we're just basically going to copy the existing state, which has the elements set elements, and then we're just going to return the element and set elements function, array. And instead of just hardwiring this as an array, we're going to pass in the initial state. And then we're going to take this use history and replace that use state. So if you haven't created your own custom hook before, congratulations, that's as simple as it gets. So we have this history hook now, which you can see, and it has, if I open it up, it has a state, which is this array. And now as we draw items, we have, it's exactly the same functionality before, but we've got this new custom hook. Like we discussed earlier, we actually want an array of arrays, which is going to represent our history. So we're going to do that here. So we're just going to rename this one to history, and let's call this set history. And instead of just taking the initial state, what we're actually going to do is wrap that around an array. So this is the history array, and we're actually just going to start off with basically the first element is going to be the empty one, and then we're going to update this one to have, for example, the first element, just like we talked about before. So this set history, instead of exposing this directly, we're going to create our own function that's going to update that in a better way. So what we can do is, let's do const, and we'll call this one set, I think I just called it set state. And this takes in an action. And if you're familiar with the use state before, if we go look at our usages of set elements, this can either take in the new state, so directly takes in the new state, or it can take in a function or an action with the argument of the previous state and outputs the new state, right? So that's something we need to take into account. So this action, like I said, it could either be a function or the new state, so we don't know which one it's going to be yet. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a new variable called new state, and we're going to check type of action. So if it's a function, then we're going to call the function with the previous state. I'm just going to do previous state here. We don't have that yet. Otherwise, we're just going to return, let's pop in question mark here, so return. Otherwise, we're just going to return the action because we know at this point it is the new state. So what is the previous state or the current state? Well, that is one of these, one of the items in this array. And like I said in the description, or when we talked about the theory, we need an index number to track that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to have an index state, set index, use state, and that's just going to start off at 0. So the previous state, or the existing state, I guess, is history at index, whatever index we're at. So now we've got the new state. Now all we need to do is we need to make sure we update our history with the new state. So let's try to do that and see how it goes. So we can just do a set history, and we want to take the previous state. We want to basically spread that. So we're just saying, hey, make a copy of the existing history and now add this new state, which is a new new point in time that we can kind of go back and forth from. And of course, we need to now say, hey, now that we've got the new state, we need to update the index, set index, to point to that latest state because we want to move forward. And then later on, when we want to undo, we can start moving the index back. So we can do set index previous +1. That's fine. And now instead of exposing the entire history, what we actually just want to expose is one of the arrays inside the history. So we're just going to actually do history index. So that's going to say, hey, start off at the first history, and as we update, move along. And instead of exposing the set history function, we're going to expose this set state function. Cool. So let's have a quick look at where we're at now. So we have this hooks history state here. We open that. That's great. We have the index and we have this array of states. And if I try to draw a line, oops, what's going on here? So try to draw a line and we've somehow created 145 pieces of state. That's obviously not what we want. So let's have a quick look at what's going on. If we jump over to the set elements here, which is what we were calling before, you can see that it's called in the update element function. And we had the update element function, which is basically being called as we move the mouse, right? So when we create a rectangle, when we click down, so let me just refresh this page. I'll open this up again. When I click down, we've created this entry, which is fine. That's what we want. But now, as I'm moving, because we were previously constantly updating the state, what it's doing is it's creating a new state for basically every mouse movement that it finds, which is not what we want. So we have a problem here. So what we actually want is, all right, when I click down, you can create the new entry, the new state. That's fine. But after that, don't continue to create a new one. Just update that one in place until I'm finished, and then just stop. Right. So we want to update that one in place. So we need to update the hook to do this. So ideally we do this in that, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to add it onto my hook, because I think this is a much simpler way. So I'm going to add a second variable here called overwrite. We're going to default this to false, and what this variable is going to do is it's going to tell the hook, actually when we're setting the state, if the override is set to true, override the last state. Don't create new arrays, override the last one in the history object. Otherwise, of course, just continue as normal. So we still need the new state here. We're just going to do a quick check here. If overwrite, if that's true, and else. So we'll just bring these two inside the else function. So if we're not overriding, we're just going to continue to do the exact same. If we are overriding, what we're going to do is we're going to take a copy of the existing history. So history copy is equal to, we'll just take the copy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the current actual state within the history. So that's the history copy at index. And we're going to make that the new state. So updating that in place. And then we're going to set history to history copy. There we go. And then, so that should handle this situation. And we can go down to our update element function, go into the set elements and just add a true here, because this is where we want to override instead of creating the new state. So let's just see if that's working. So I'm going to open up history here, make sure you can see that. And if I click on rectangle, I click down and it's created a new piece of state. And as I move around, it's just updating it in place. Cool. So now I can click again, create two, line. That's the third one. Perfect. So that's all working fine. So I think at this point we can add our undo and redo buttons and just test out the base functionality. So I'm going to scroll down to our JSX. Let's open this up. Let's just add another div just under the existing buttons. It's going to be position fixed. That's absolutely fine. Let's add a button with an on click. We'll add that in a second. This is going to be the undo function, and we'll add one for the redo function. So that should be fine. That should show up at the top. So what we're going to do as well, we're just going to add bottom 0 and just give it a bit of padding, just so it's not too close to the edges. There we go. So we have our undo and redo buttons. So if we go back up to our hook, what we're going to do is we're going to create an undo and redo function. So const undo and redo. So let's do undo and redo functionality. And like I said in the kind of the theory part, undo and redo, all we're doing is just shifting the index, right? So we're either saying go back an index or go forward, right? So we can just take this and essentially copy and paste it here. So for undo, we want to go -1. For redo, we're going to do +1. And we just want to add a quick check actually to make sure that we're not at 0, so we don't go kind of out of bounds. So we just need to make sure index is more than 0 for undo, or make sure index is less than the history.length -1. So we don't go out of bounds there as well. Cool. So what we're going to do with these two functions is we're just going to expose them as part of the array here, so we don't change the API too much. And now that we've done that, what we can do is inside the app, we can just destructure undo and redo. And then where we just added the two buttons, we can just pass in those functions again, undo and redo. Perfect. Cool. So that should be that. Let's try draw some elements. So we draw a square, rectangle, rectangle, line, and we can just see the history is all working fine. We're at state 4. So if I do undo, that should just basically take the index down to 3. Perfect. Undo again, redo. Great. So that's the kind of, and we keep on doing that, that's all working fine. So this is the minimum to get the undo and redo functions working. We're still missing one thing though, which is the movement. So if we take, so now we're at index 4, if we take this and we move it down, it's still updated the last one in place, right? Because we're calling the update function, this update function here, and we've of course passed in the true flag there, right? So it's not creating a new entry, which is going to cause a problem because now it's just updated the last one in state. So if I undo now, where it should move this up, it's actually just going to kind of take it into this weird state, which is obviously wrong. So what we can do is a very, very quick fix for that is when we do the handle mouse down, so when we click down, whether we're moving or resizing, which is basically if we're in the selection tool, what we can do is we can just say, hey, if we're in the selection tool, what to do is just make a copy of the last state. Just make a copy of it as is, don't change anything. And then we already have the logic in the update function that will continue to update it. So we can do set elements, pre-state or previous state. We can just do previous state here again, right? So we're just making a copy. That way it will just be updated by the update element, but it's updating a new snapshot instead. So if we have a look at what that means, if we open up the history state here, we create a rectangle. As soon as I click, that's fine, we've got a new element. We move, let go, that's fine, it's updated. And now with the selection tool, when I click, again, it creates a new element. And then the same thing, it updates as I move around. So now if I've moved that and I hit undo, it's going to take it back. Cool, so we're missing one final thing to round out this functionality, and this is rewriting history. So as it stands, if I kind of draw a couple of elements, when I undo and I then basically draw new elements, i.e. I override the history, what we expect is basically everything that's after the current index, which is 1, to basically be wiped, right? Because we don't care about that, we've written a new path. At the moment it doesn't do that, so we kind of get this weird behavior where it's drawing things in the middle and then it starts to cause all kinds of issues. So that's a very quick fix. What we can do is when we're creating these new pieces of history, we can just basically say, instead of making a copy of the entire history, only take the pieces of history that are up to the current index, and then basically that disregards everything in the future, and then we just add the new state. So what we can do there is do const, let's just call this updated state, and that will be equal to, so we take the existing, make a copy of the existing history, and what we'll do is we'll just slice it. So we'll do slice, and we'll start at 0, and we'll take that all the way up to index +1. And instead of setting the history with the entire previous history, we'll just take that updated state and we'll add the new state, so that overrides everything that would have been in the future, and that should be it. So if I come back and refresh this guy, so if I draw, I'll just open this up a second, I'll draw one line, draw a second line. Now if I, let's draw a third line actually, so just so we have 3. So if I undo twice, 1, 2, and now I draw a rectangle, what we should see is, yeah, so we had 3, 2 of them got removed, and we added a new state, and now we can continue. Yeah, and that's pretty much everything done. So what we'll do now is we'll just I'll quickly kind of paste some code in to show how to get this working with the key down, so Control or Command Z and Command Shift Z, and we can wrap it up. So we're just going to add a use effect, and within the use effect, we're just going to call the document.addListener with the key down event, and we're going to pass in a function. We'll also add in a return to clean up, so remove the listener, and the function is just taking in an event. It's just checking for the Control or Command key, depending on whether you're on Mac or Windows, is pressed, as well as the Z key for undoing, and then it just also checks the Shift key. So Command Shift is for undoing, Command Z is for undoing, and Command Shift Z is for redoing. And then we just add the dependencies in. So that's basically how you would add in the key presses. So as you put these in, undo and redo. And I think that's everything I want to cover in this video. So thank you very much for watching. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.